Logical fallacy, appeal to ignorance. The appeal to ignorance is a logical fallacy that occurs when an argument is made based on the absence of evidence, rather than the presence of evidence. This fallacy assumes that a statement is true simply because it has not been proven false, or false because it has not been proven true. Essentially, it uses the lack of evidence as evidence to support a particular conclusion, which is logically unsound. There are two main types of appeals to ignorance: the argument from ignorance and the argument to ignorance. The argument from ignorance is when someone argues that something is true because there is no evidence to disprove it. For example, if someone argues that aliens must exist because there is no evidence to prove that they don't exist, they are committing the argument from ignorance fallacy. The argument to ignorance is when someone argues that something is false because there is no evidence to prove it. For example, if someone argues that ghosts don't exist because there is no evidence to prove that they do exist, they are committing the argument to ignorance fallacy. One of the problems with the appeal to ignorance is that it can be used to support any claim, regardless of its validity. For example, someone could argue that Bigfoot exists because there is no evidence to disprove its existence. But by the same logic, someone else could argue that unicorns exist because there is no evidence to disprove their existence. This type of reasoning is not based on evidence or rationality, but rather on a lack of evidence, which is not a solid foundation for any argument. The appeal to ignorance can also be used to perpetuate myths and misinformation. For example, some people argue that vaccines are dangerous because there is no evidence to prove that they are safe. This argument is not based on any evidence or scientific research, but rather on a lack of evidence. In reality, there is a wealth of scientific evidence that shows that vaccines are safe and effective, but the appeal to ignorance can be used to discredit this evidence and perpetuate harmful myths. Another problem with the appeal to ignorance is that it can be difficult to disprove. If someone argues that aliens must exist because there is no evidence to disprove their existence, it can be difficult to provide evidence to the contrary. In some cases, this fallacy can be used to shift the burden of proof onto those who are skeptical of a claim, rather than on those making the claim. In order to avoid the appeal to ignorance fallacy, it is important to base arguments on evidence and logical reasoning, rather than on a lack of evidence. It is also important to be aware of the burden of proof in any argument. The burden of proof is on the person making the claim, not on those who are skeptical of the claim. If someone makes an extraordinary claim, such as the existence of Bigfoot or aliens, they have the burden of providing evidence to support their claim. In conclusion, the appeal to ignorance is a fallacy that can be used to support any claim, regardless of its validity. This fallacy assumes that something is true or false based on a lack of evidence, rather than on actual evidence. It can be used to perpetuate myths and misinformation, and it can be difficult to disprove. To avoid this fallacy, it is important to base arguments on evidence and logical reasoning, and to be aware of the burden of proof in any argument. By doing so, we can avoid being misled by fallacious arguments and instead arrive at more rational and evidence-based conclusions.